Opening the center immediately, this pawn jump sets up an ambitious battle for early board control and piece development. Mirroring the king's pawn establishes an immediate symmetrical struggle for central space, setting the stage for a balanced, classical engagement. Developing a knight to f3 immediately pressures black's central pawn, a classic opening gambit that opens lines for further piece activity. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move reinforces the e5 pawn while preparing to connect the rooks and activate other pieces. Instantly challenging black's knight, this bishop places pressure and sets the stage for varied Spanish game structures. Countering the Spanish opening with a direct attack on the e4 pawn, this knight's advance initiates a dynamic central skirmish. Solidifying the center, this pawn advance subtly prepares to develop the queenside bishop and offers a potential pawn lever. Developing the bishop to this active diagonal directly challenges white's center and prepares for kingside castling. Preparing to expand queenside territory, this maneuver aims to secure a pawn majority and potentially open lines for future pressure. Safely tucking the king away prioritizes king safety and prepares for active piece play on the queen side. The castled king finds immediate sanctuary, a crucial step in securing the monarch while simultaneously preparing to activate the rooks along the newly cleared files. Solidifying the center and preparing for potential pawn breaks establishes a firmer foothold for black's pieces. Securing the d4 square for a potential pawn advance, while preparing to swing the knight to its more active f3 outpost, demonstrates a subtle yet important piece repositioning for the center. Seeking central influence and preparing for a potential kingside expansion, this knight redirects towards more active squares, a prudent defensive adjustment given white's solid pawn structure and the potential for threats against black's developing pieces. Preparing to reroute the rook to the king's flank opens up attacking possibilities against black's potentially exposed monarch after castling kingside. Shifting the knight to g6 might seem passive, but it cleverly prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm with f5, while also unblocking the f8 bishop to aim at white's center. It's a subtle but effective redirection of black's energy, hinting at future counterplay. Opening the center with this pawn thrust immediately creates dynamic possibilities and challenges black's pawn structure, forcing a decision about how to address the central tension. Retreating the bishop to b6 frees up the c7 square for the knight, preparing its advance, and also offers a safe haven for the bishop from the central pawn storm white is building. It sidesteps immediate confrontation while maintaining bishop activity and implicitly reinforcing d6. Repositioning the bishop to f1 is a subtle maneuver, aiming to reroute it to a more active diagonal, perhaps g2 or h3, to indirectly pressure black's kingside or prepare for a kingside pawn storm. It also liberates the d2 knight from its defensive post, allowing it to jump into the fray on e4 or c4, thereby increasing white's central influence. This move prioritizes harmonious piece development and long-term strategic buildup over immediate tactical aggression. Anchoring the queenside pawn structure and preparing to challenge the central tension, this maneuver solidifies black's position while subtly preparing for potential pawn pushes like b5 or a6, aiming to gain queenside space. Boldly repositioning the knight to c4, white seeks to disrupt black's intended central control and potentially eye the d6 pawn, while also preparing to challenge the robust bishop on b6. This maneuver signifies a subtle shift from passive defense to a more assertive, perhaps even provocative middle-game stance, aiming to exploit any slight inaccuracies in black's setup. Seeking to untangle its pieces, black redirects its bishop to a more defensive square, a pragmatic choice that aims to avoid immediate pressure on the f7 pawn while still keeping an eye on potential central advances. Opening the central diagonal for the queen's bishop, this exchange immediately clarifies the pawn structure and forces black to reevaluate their central presence. White is aiming to gain space on the kingside and potentially create pressure against the weakened pawn chain if black isn't careful with their subsequent development. The knight on c4, now unsupported, might become a target, but its presence also restricts black's maneuvering. This isn't just a pawn trade. It's a catalyst for a positional reevaluation, shifting the focus to piece activity and control of open lines. Embracing the central pawn exchange now, black recaptures, asserting their presence in the heart of the board and aiming to neutralize white's immediate pawn pressure, potentially opening lines for their pieces. Initiating a queen trade now, with the objective of simplifying the position and potentially transitioning to a more favorable endgame for white due to the slight space advantage and better pawn structure, is a bold decision. This maneuver aims to alleviate the pressure on white's king and activate the remaining pieces with fewer obstacles. Embracing the open file, black repositions their rook to the central column, a proactive step toward asserting influence and creating potential mating nets as the queens depart the board. Unpinning the knight allows for better piece mobility, aiming to challenge the central control black has been building. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on a more active diagonal is a sensible reaction to the repositioning of white's knight, aiming to avoid being passively hemmed in and to reclaim some attacking influence. Securing the queenside with the pawn advance aims to create space for the rook, potentially initiating operations on the file or supporting a future b5 push to gain a foothold in black's territory, while simultaneously challenging black's bishop on c7 and preventing its easy retreat. A measured repositioning, 15. rd7 aims to connect the rooks and prepare for a potential central pawn push, a sound positional objective now that the queens have been exchanged and the kingside structure is solid. Opening the h-file and potentially freeing the g-pawn for future advance, this exchange simplifies the position while targeting the now exposed dark squares around black's king. White prioritizes active piece play over material retention, accepting a slight positional concession for the chance to exploit black's less harmonious piece placement. It signals a shift towards a more dynamic middle game, where precise calculation and dynamic pawn breaks will be key to seizing the initiative. This decision underscores the importance of initiative and active counterplay, even at the cost of a pawn if it leads to superior development and attacking chances. Opening the g-file for your rook is a significant consequence of this capture, though it leaves your king's pawn shield fragmented. This capture dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a potentially weak dark square complex around your king while simultaneously opening a vital diagonal for your queen's bishop. By taking with the g-pawn, you sacrifice the structural integrity of your kingside for immediate material recapture and open lines, a trade-off that demands careful positional maneuvering going forward. The decision to recapture with the pawn rather than the knight is a commitment to an asymmetric pawn structure, potentially leading to dynamic play and challenging endgame scenarios. This immediate pawn recapture on f6 is a strategic concession, creating doubled pawns and exposing your king, yet it also liberates the g-file for potential counterplay. Shaping the kingside pawn structure now solidifies white's central control and prepares to actively contest the d-file, even though the immediate capture of the bishop has gifted black a doubled pawn. Re-establishing a central presence and preparing to contest the d-file, black aims to activate the rook and challenge white's slightly passive bishop placement. Pushing the pawn here creates a subtle but significant space advantage on the queen side, potentially limiting black's maneuvering options for the rook on d7 and future queen activity. Unveiling the king from its protective castling shell opens up immediate defensive concerns. Prioritizing king safety and central control now becomes paramount. The knight's repositioning to the center signals a clear intent to improve its post, potentially eyeing squares like c4 or d5 and offering better support to the queenside pawns. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for a potential kingside pawn advance, this knight redeployment aims to solidify black's position and offer a fresh avenue for attack, cleverly sidestepping white's pressure on the kingside. Initiating an aggressive pawn push up the kingside, white aims to carve out space and potentially create attacking avenues, even though the immediate target isn't fully developed. Strategic rationale, asterisk the pawn advance from h4 is a commitment, signaling white's intention to either expand on the kingside or force black to react defensively. It might be preparing a future g4 push, aiming to undermine black's kingside pawn structure, or it could be a way to gain more breathing room for white's pieces. It also potentially restricts black's knight on g6 should it decide to reposition. Potential implications. Asterisk, this move could lead to a more dynamic middle game. If black is not careful, white might be able to open lines towards the black king. Conversely, this pawn push could overextend if not supported, creating weaknesses that black might exploit later. It's a provocative move that demands attention. Shifting the knight towards the kingside, a seemingly passive redeployment, now aims to bolster the weak kingside pawns and potentially reinforce the defense of the king. This maneuver, though subtle, addresses the growing pressure along the kingside after white's recent pawn advances. It's a prophylactic measure, preparing to contest the vital light squares should white attempt to exploit them further. Consider the long-term implications. As white consolidates, black's knight might find a more active role supporting an eventual kingside pawn push, or perhaps it will pivot back to the center if the opportunity arises. It's a patient approach, prioritizing solidity over immediate fireworks. The bishop on c7 is now better protected, and the knight's journey isn't a wasted tempo, but rather a strategic repositioning for future battles. The knight's return to a more central defensive posture will be crucial if white decides to push their own kingside pawns, creating a more robust defensive structure. Securing the king from potential threats, this move also prepares for the potential opening of the kingside files, giving white some breathing room as the endgame approaches. The knight's journey to d6 injects dynamism into black's position, eyeing the weak f5 square and creating potential for an eventual pawn push or piece repositioning that could destabilize white's otherwise solid pawn structure. Shifting the knight to this square aims to reposition it for a more active role, potentially eyeing the kingside or supporting a central pawn push later, while also clearing the path for the queen's rook. Black's push to b6 aims to seize control of the queenside, potentially creating space for the b-pawn to advance and challenge white's a5 pawn, while also opening a diagonal for the c8 bishop. This proactive stance attempts to counterbalance white's established kingside presence and the central pawn chain. However, this maneuver might also weaken the queenside pawn structure if not carefully supported, presenting white with opportunities for future exploitation on the open queenside files. Injecting immediate tactical friction into the queenside, this knight rerouting aggressively challenges the bishop's scope while preparing to seize the open c-file and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Seizing the central square with the knight offers a temporary pawn advance, but it concedes immediate control of the d5 square and invites black to consolidate their position. Reclaiming the central outpost the knight now occupies, the knight's return to a central square signals a shift towards a more active, coordinated presence. Instantly disrupting white's centralized knight, this pawn thrust aims to exploit the open b-file and potentially gain space on the queenside, while simultaneously questioning the knight's current placement. Initiating a maneuvering game, white repositions the knight towards the kingside, anticipating future attacking possibilities or reinforcing central control as the queens are off the board. The rook plunges into the enemy camp, a bold assertion of activity aimed at disrupting white's queenside pawn structure. A calculated repositioning, this rook shuffle aims to gain influence over the now open d-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside, even if it means conceding control of the 7th rank for the moment. Reclaiming the open file opens a crucial path for the rook, promising increased activity and potential for infiltration into white's weakened queenside. Solidifying the center's control by recapturing the bishop establishes a more robust pawn structure for white, which is crucial for exploiting any future weaknesses in black's position, especially with the rook now poised to contest the open d-file. Reactivating the rook to the open d-file, this initiative aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure on white's queenside and potentially create threats against the exposed king. Shifting the bishop to g4 immediately attacks the rook and forces a decision about its placement, potentially opening lines for white's pieces on the kingside or creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure as the rook retreats. Unleashing a sudden rook check, black exploits white's exposed king and potentially creates an open file for further action, injecting a much-needed dose of dynamism into a rather static position. The white king, now exposed on the third rank after the rook sacrifice, becomes a significant target, inviting further aggressive incursions. The pawn thrust creates an immediate structural weakness on the king side, inviting further infiltration and potentially isolating the dark-squared bishop. Strategically repositioning the bishop to f5 aims to exploit the potential weakness on the kingside diagonals, particularly if black decides to advance the h-pawn further, potentially creating an outpost for white's pieces or creating opportunities for a kingside attack. This maneuver also subtly contests control of the important dark squares, which could become crucial in a maneuvering game. Reclaiming the central files with the rook and establishing a more active defense for the king, while preparing to contest the remaining open file. Reclaiming the initiative on the kingside by repositioning the knight signals an intent to both defend against immediate threats and prepare for future central or queenside operations, acknowledging the slightly exposed king position after the recent pawn storm. Suddenly seizing the open file with the rook is a bold gamble, aiming to disrupt white's reorganized pawn structure and create immediate threats, though it exposes the rook to a potential discovered attack if white can reposition the knight effectively. Liberating the bishop from its pawn cage to secure control of the critical diagonal, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's newly solidified pawn structure and challenge the exposed king. Embracing the doubled pawns, black secures a central pawn majority and aims to activate the e-file, a clear positional concession for white's pawn structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, white aims to prevent black's rook from becoming too active along the open second rank, while also creating potential counterplay on the file if black isn't careful. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside now dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's otherwise solid defensive setup, a bold attempt to inject dynamism into a somewhat static position. The rook slides into the open file, challenging black's king by placing the defender of the g7 pawn on an awkward diagonal. The black king, now exposed on the 7th rank, must seek sanctuary, and moving it to e7 is the most immediate way to escape the open d-file's pressure and potential threats from white's rook. Initiating a strategic redeployment of the knight to a more active central outpost, potentially eyeing the weak squares around black's pawn chain. Re-establishing attacking pressure on the kingside, this rook maneuver aims to disrupt white's precarious pawn structure while creating infiltration possibilities. Protecting the monarch is paramount now, ushering in a phase where the king's safety dictates piece placement and potential pawn advances. Unleashing the e-pawn now creates significant central tension and forces white's hand, potentially opening lines for your pieces that were previously clogged. Re-establishing knight presence on the central squares, white aims to curb black's burgeoning pawn majority on the queenside and potentially launch a counterthrust on the kingside by transferring this knight to a more active post. Suddenly, the initiative shifts as black forcefully breaks into white's weakened kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch and the awkward placement of the knight. Dislodging the opponent's exposed monarch from its current shelter offers a golden opportunity to exploit the open diagonals. Snatching the isolated pawn might seem tempting, but it opens up the white king to immediate threats and offers no clear compensation for the lost material. Activating the knight to d4 injects a fresh dynamic into the board, aiming to disrupt black's recently consolidated pawn structure and create immediate threats against the unprotected king. This maneuver attempts to reposition the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure on the kingside and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside, though it leaves the bishop on a somewhat exposed diagonal.